First of all, good evening. Um, the narrative itself is a very important aspect of history. Our personal narratives, they're those individual threads that help make up the fabric of humanity. They help us understand each other's perspective and our histories. Not having these threads, not having these pieces, leaves a lot of gaps within history. And not having these missing narratives, these missing threads, leaves holes that can lead to the unraveling of us and within our human perspective, our human experience, and the overall human narrative. My mother, she grew up in the era of the civil rights movement and was captive to Jim Crow regulations. She knew the pain that came with being one of the first people to integrate her school as a child. Now, as she grew into adulthood, served in the military, she felt as though we had somehow surpassed this, but at least those issues within the past. But there was a part of her that felt that we hadn't. And that was made very evident the night of the Trayvon Martin case's verdict. She was visiting me in Arizona at the time, and we talked about the case. We went back and forth, and I'm a cynical person, so I was sitting there thinking, like, I know what's going to happen with this case. I'm not putting any faith into this. I know what's going to happen. But my mother, on the other hand, she held out some hope. But I saw that hope and that perspective that she had about the world and about herself shatter because of two words: not guilty. I watched my mother's face completely change from having a glimmer of hope to complete devastation. And as I looked at her, I'm still thinking with a cynical mind. I'm like, it's just another day that ends in Y. I'm looking at her, and I'm seeing everything come apart. Everything that she had done, everything she had accomplished. And while I'm inspecting her and looking at her, she cuts through and says things that shocked me at that moment and stick with me to this day. We don't matter. We don't matter. No matter how hard we work, no matter what we provide for society, no matter if we happen to serve our country, which she had done proudly for over 30 years, we just don't matter. There's no one who can tell me any differently. That stayed with me. That following year, my wife and I were expecting the birth of our daughter. And I reflected on that night with my mother. And I thought about what I would want someone to know about me and what I would definitely want my daughter to know about me. But as I started compiling all these stories to build my own narrative, racism, bigotry, love, loss, school, professional experience, and just life in general, I realized I hadn't shared my own stories because my mother was looking at that case from a different perspective. She was looking at it as a mother. She was looking at it as a mother of boys. So when that Trayvon Martin case took place, she saw that young man as her own son. And what she saw was this young man's narrative was distorted and destroyed to make his life have no value. And it really sunk in at that moment when I was putting all this stuff together. His narrative was changed. I need to control my narrative. So I read all these things and read them back, and I went through the notes, and I realized I hadn't shared any of this stuff with anybody. So I compiled everything, created a manuscript, sent a copy to my mother, sent a copy to my father. They'll fight over who got theirs first. But when they got it, they called me and talked about, well, it's really interesting. And I thought, okay, you guys like it. And they started looking at what was in the manuscript and realized this is stuff that happened to me when I was a kid. This reminds me of this. But they didn't tell me at this moment that they were going and sharing the manuscripts with their friends, giving them copies, letting them read it when they would come over to the house, friends, family, just, extended family who happened to visit them. So when I went to places like Louisiana and Mississippi and Virginia to visit relatives, I unknowingly and unintentionally started conversations for people 20, 30, 40, 60 years my senior. And they were talking about stuff that had taken place when they were growing up. They were talking about stuff they hadn't talked about in years. Getting drafted and going and fighting in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, hosting SNCC workers, fighting against the Klan. Like, all these things are coming out. So as I'm visiting, everyone's coming to me and telling me their stories, and I go to them, I'm like, why haven't you shared this before? And they really didn't have an answer. They just thought that their stories didn't matter. One incident, I was sitting at the kitchen table of my grandparents' home in Virginia, and my Aunt Mary was telling me just as matter-of-factly about how my grandfather was hosting SNCC workers during the 60s and pushing a voter registration drive in rural Virginia. And there was a group of individuals who did not like the fact that he was exercising his constitutional rights. They showed up on his property in full regalia and all their sheets and hoods and torches and guns. And this proud man, father, husband, walks out onto his porch with his shotgun. And they inform him, we know what you're doing with the church. You're bringing these people in. You're riling people up. Stop it. My grandfather turns the tables on him. This is my land. All of you boys get off my land and don't come back, because if you do, you'll never leave. And I just thought for a moment while I was sitting there as my Aunt Mary was telling me the story, I'm like, oh my God, what happened to Grandpa? Did he make it? And I'm starting to think, because I'm so pulled out of reality, I forget that my grandfather is seated in the room next to me. But then I look at her and say, Aunt Mary, why didn't anybody tell us any of these stories? Because she integrated her university, Longwood College, now Longwood University. Why didn't you guys tell me any of these stories? And before my Aunt Mary could cut through, my mother, give me her response, my mother cuts through and says, nobody wants to hear any of that. And more importantly, we're tired of talking about it. We don't want to talk about it because nobody's interested. Now, I'm up here on this stage, and I feel fully confident and safe to say this right now because my mother's in the audience, and she can't get to me right now. You're wrong. Completely wrong. Because people want to hear these stories, and more importantly, they need to hear these stories. Keeping these stories buried or uncovered do nothing more than create those holes within this fabric of humanity. You have these holes, starts to unravel, and we have problems coming back together. I turned this into more personal and professional research as I would interview people from all walks of life, entertainers, athletes, politicians. There were some activists I got in touch with, and they all said the same thing. I didn't think anybody was interested in my story. They were wrong. My first year here at the University of Mississippi as a history doctoral student, I was asked by the University of Mississippi Slavery Research Group to start leading tours. And in leading the tours, I understood the importance of the narrative, or at least it was further cemented in me, the importance of the narrative, and how badly a missing narrative can affect history. The University of Mississippi Slavery Research Group has been doing work for years about those missing narratives that we have on this campus. And what we start to ask ourselves is, what if? Not just, what if things didn't happen, like if we didn't have we didn't have Anne Frank's diary, or we didn't have Night by Elie Wiesel. But what if this woman could talk? What if we could get her story? And the issue with us, and really the task and the mission for all of us, is we need to uncover and embrace these narratives of the past. We need to weave their threads back into this fabric of humanity, or else all we do is come apart at the seams. Thank you.